A woman who nearly stabbed to death her classmate when she was just a preteen in order to appease a fictional character is asking a judge yet again to free her from a psychiatric hospital.
Miss Geyser and Miss Wire attempt to kill and wanted to kill the victim. The reports show that she was stabbed 19 times in the body, torso. Was basically left to bleed to death.
Morgan Geyser was just 12 years old when she and her friend Anissa Wire lured their classmate Peyton Lautner to a Waukesha, Wisconsin park. It was there Geyser brutally stabbed Lautner 19 times while Wire egged her on. Lautner barely escaped with her life that day. The case sent shockwaves across the globe when Geyser and Wire told investigators they carried out the stabbing to earn the right to be servants of a sinister yet fictional character named Slender Man. They told police they feared the tall and faceless character would harm their families if they didn't carry out the attack. Since the near-fatal stabbing that took place a decade ago, a lot has changed. In December of 2017, Anissa Wire was sentenced to 25 years in a mental hospital after pleading guilty to being a party to attempted second-degree intentional homicide. But she claimed she wasn't responsible for her actions because she was mentally ill, which a Wisconsin jury agreed. Then in 2021, Wire was granted release after spending nearly 4 years at the Winnebago Mental Health Institute. Under her release, she was ordered to live with her father, receive psychiatric treatment, and submit to around-the-clock GPS monitoring. But the monitor was removed in September of 2023. Now Morgan Geyser is hoping for the same, despite not being successful the first 2 times around. The Slender Man stabbing case, as well as a lot of other stories that we cover here at Law&Crime, are pretty tough. And part of the reason we're able to keep bringing you these types of stories is because of our great sponsors. So I want to really quickly thank Upside for sponsoring us. If you're wondering what's Upside, well, it's a free app that gets you cash back on daily essentials like gas and groceries. And it's actual real cash back too. The money appears in your Upside app that you can transfer straight into your bank account. So here's what you do. You download the Upside app, then claim an offer for whatever you're buying on Upside. I went to 7-Eleven, got some snacks, some candy, some other items, used the app, and honestly, it's super simple. You can use the app at places like Shell, Exxon, and fast food favorites like Taco Bell and Chipotle, and that's just to name a few. So to find out how much you could earn, download Upside, or click the link in the description and use our promo code LCNews to get 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. Again, that's promo code LCNews for an extra 25 cents back on your first gallon of gas. In 2022, Geyser withdrew her first petition for release 2 months after filing it. Then this past April, Geyser had a hearing to determine if she should be released. Dr. Deborah Collins, who evaluated Geyser on several occasions since 2014, months after the stabbing, testified she wasn't ready for conditional release.
But if it is, if it's granted, and if over the next coming months, call it 2 months, you don't say a number of months in your report, let's call it 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, over that period of time, if Morgan continues on the track she's on and continues doing the things that you describe here, then you would say it's appropriate for her to be in the community, right?
There will be a point when I anticipate she will be, or believe she will be ready for conditional release in the coming months.
Okay. How many months is that, if you had to estimate? Is it 2?
I don't know.
Let's just assume hypothetically the path that you've seen with Morgan, the positive trajectory you've seen, let's just assume it continues exactly as you've seen. Is 2 more months at Winnebago sufficient?
My best estimate would be 6 to 12 months.
Dr. Brooke Lundbaum, who also evaluated Geyser, testified the now 22-year-old hasn't thought about the fictional Slender Man for a while, but was adamant there were still concerns about her release.
And just to kind of more directly address a question I know the court had yesterday, and it's also been hinted at, you don't believe that Ms. Geyser faked symptoms to avoid responsibility for the index offense, correct?
Right.
Nor does the rest of her medical team and treatment providers historically, true?
True.
So the general consensus is that there were psychosis symptoms at the time, that they lasted. Is it also the case that the consensus is now that they have resolved to the extent that they've been absent for an extended period of time?
If we are looking very specifically at those specific delusional ideas that contributed to the index offense, yes, that's absolutely true, that there's been an absence of belief related to, say, Slender Man for several years. If we're talking about symptoms more broadly, there continue to be concerns.
But there was some who thought Geyser had enough treatment at the psychiatric hospital, like Dr. Kenneth Robbins.
What's your opinion specifically about Morgan and her petition for conditional release?
My opinion is that this is an appropriate time for her to be conditionally released.
In your report, you said that it's an ideal time for her to be released. Why is it an ideal time right now?
Because Morgan has improved quite dramatically and needs things that the institution can no longer offer. I think she's benefited a great deal by being at Winnebago in many different ways, but I think she's reached the end of what Winnebago is able to help her with. There's no suggestion that she is dangerous at this time. And the kinds of things that Morgan needs, in my view, help with socialization, help with education, help with becoming independent, are things that Winnebago can no longer provide in an effective way.
Okay, so there's no more treatment she can do at Winnebago. There's no more treatment she can do at Winnebago.
So there's more treatment. I think the downside of being at Winnebago is greater than any benefit that she could receive from the treatment that's offered there.
Psychiatrist Dr. Kayla Pope, who works at the state mental hospital where Geyser lives, was called to testify by the judge. She echoed Dr. Robbins' conclusion that it's critical for Morgan's development to be granted conditional release.
You're aware that both of them find Morgan at this time not suitable for conditional release?
I did hear their testimony to that effect.
And they believe that Morgan still represents a significant risk of bodily harm to herself or others?
I did hear their testimony to that effect.
You don't agree with that?
I would say I probably agree more with Dr. Robbins' assessment of the situation. Morgan has not had any dangerousness for several years now. And I do think at this point it is critical for her to make the transition to the community to help with her ongoing development.
You don't believe 6 months from now she would be less ready to go into the community, do you?
No. But I do think that critical period for development is closing, as Dr. Robbins identified.
During Geyser's April hearing, she elected not to testify. And when it came time for the judge's ruling, he ultimately ruled Geyser still presented a risk to herself and the community.
This court is satisfied by evidence that's clear and convincing that Ms. Geyser does pose a significant risk of bodily harm to herself, to others, or of serious property damage for the reasons that I've stated. Now, as she works hard, she continues to do what she's supposed to do, but that doesn't change this risk. Remember that the community is concerned with risk, dangerous risk. The community is concerned to a great extent as well with what happens to Ms. Geyser. But the primary concern in the balancing, and we talked about balancing earlier, in the Randall case, they talk about the balancing that goes on in the court's decision. The ultimate determination of dangerousness requires a careful balancing of society's interest in protection from harmful conduct against the equitee's interest in personal liberty and as well as autonomy. So that's the balance. But the balance is the public interest in staying away from harmful conduct. Under these circumstances, this court's satisfied that the scales tip in favor of the public, and it tips that way by clear and convincing evidence. So in this matter, after hearing all of the credible evidence, which I'm satisfied was very well presented by both the state as well as by the defense, I'm satisfied that the petition should be denied.
Now Geyser hopes on the third time around the judge says yes. The one-page petition cites state laws that requires the judge to appoint at least one expert to examine Geyser and produce a report within 30 days of being appointed. That hearing is set for early next month. So how likely is it Morgan Geyser will actually be released? I want to bring on now clinical and forensic psychologist Dr. Joni Johnston. Joni, it's always so great to see you. You know, the Slender Man case was everywhere when it had happened, but now more than a decade later, Morgan Geyser is still in a psychiatric hospital, hoping to be released just like Anissa Weier. Joni, what's been your reaction to Geyser applying for her third chance now at release?
Well, it makes sense in a way that she would be there longer than her co-defendant at the time. I think that she was perceived as kind of the mastermind. She got a longer sentence. And so I think that it makes sense that the people who are evaluating her, who've been treating her, are likely proceeding with caution. They want to make sure that if she's to be released, that she's going to be safe in the community, that she's on her way to living a life that's crime-free, and that she's able to, have some insight into her mental health disorder. And so there's a lot of factors that go into evaluating whether somebody is ready to be released into the community. And of course, safety is the number one concern.
And talk to me about what all goes into this type of evaluation and how much of her age at the time of the offense is factored into the recommendation to the judge.
Well, certainly age is always a factor when you have somebody who's 12 years old. But I think also the actual crime that's been committed is a huge factor as well. And so what's going to be happening, and what has been happening, I'm sure, is that the psychologist involved, there's always more than one, because multiple opinions, I think, are important, just to kind of make sure that one person isn't far over to one side or the other. They're going to be meeting with her, doing some psychological testing with her, and also, and in some respects, I think more importantly, really looking at her records, talking to people who've been treating her, talking to people who've been around her every day, and taking all that information and putting together some kind of assessment of whether they think she's safe to be released. I mean, it's a very, very challenging question to answer, because we can talk about statistics and likelihood and risk, but it's very, very difficult to take all of that and apply it accurately every time to one person.
And Morgan Geyser applied once, then withdrew her petition. During her second petition, she had a whole hearing where different psychiatrists who evaluated her spoke about her risk. And that second hearing happened just in April of this year. In your opinion, what makes this time different as far as Morgan petitioning the judge to be released on conditional release? And do you think that it'll be successful this time around?
Well, I think that, oftentimes when individuals are either up for parole or they're up for, in this situation, conditional release, they have a set amount of time that they have to wait to reapply. And I believe 6 months was the amount of time, the minimum amount of time that she could wait to reapply. So it makes sense to me. I know that she's certainly eager to be released and that she's been very clear about that. And so I'm sure her attorney has looked at her treatment and talked to her at length. And so, I'm not surprised that within 6 months she's applying again. So I think that's the first part of it. Whether she will be released, I think, is really going to depend upon how her evaluators and her treatment team feel specifically, I think, about her credibility and her treatment, and also about her insight into her severe mental health disorder. I know that there's been some concern about some of the statements that she's allegedly made to some of her treating clinicians, for example, saying that she, somehow faked mental illness to get out of a horrible family situation. And, on the one hand, I think people kind of look at that and they kind of go, oh my God, this is somebody who was able to fool us for 8 years and pull the wool over our eyes. I think from a treating perspective, it's the opposite concern, because if you look at her records and what's been revealed and some of the things that people who've observed her have seen, is there's a lot of documentation that this is somebody who was psychotic for a significant amount of time. And so the concern is not, was she pulling the wool over her eyes? But one of the things we know about schizophrenia is that a lack of insight can be a symptom of schizophrenia. So the question then becomes, okay, is this a person who has a severe mental health disorder but doesn't think that she does? And that's of concern, of course, because there is a connection in her case between her symptoms and what she did. And so we want to see that she is aware, that she is actively in treatment, that her symptoms are under control, and even more importantly, that she recognizes, the risk and stressors and triggers that might cause her to begin decompensating.
And why do you think a judge granted Anissa Weier conditional release and Morgan Geyser hasn't had that same opportunity? Do you think it's because at the time of the offense that it was Geyser who was the one who had stabbed Peyton Lautner, while Anissa was just the one kind of egging her on during the
I
stabbing?
think I think that was maybe a factor at the beginning. I would imagine what became more of a factor is how she progressed over the time that she spent in a forensic hospital or in a psychiatric hospital. So even though they're starting out with similar crimes, and I know that we've already talked about the fact that Morgan, I think, was held more accountable and seemed to have more of a major role in that. But I think when you're talking about release, you're also looking again at how Alyssa's been, how she progressed in the 10 years that she was there, or that 7 or 8 years that she was inside. And so if she was, for example, not exhibiting any severe mental health symptoms, if they felt like as she got away from Morgan, that there was this kind of enmeshed relationship, and as she got away from Morgan, that she began to kind of recover and she didn't seem to have severe mental health disorder, she's going to be treated differently and she's going to be perceived differently.
And in these types of requests for conditional release, how much does the judge factor in what the victim has to say?
That is such a tricky one because I think, ideally victims and victims' families would always have a voice. And I think that they certainly will have a voice, whether it's as a part of the hearing or just the fact that the judge has heard them speak before or is aware of their feelings about this. I do think when you're talking about, though, somebody who's been sentenced to a mental health facility, that is probably going to be, secondary to the community violence risk and her level of treatment and cooperation. So it's always a factor. It's not going to be, I think, the determining factor.
And Morgan Geyser didn't testify in her previous hearing that happened in April, but do you think this third time around she will? And what does her testifying, well, do you think that'll kind of help benefit her in a way, or do you think that could kind of deter her as well too in her request for release?
That's going to be a tricky decision, I think, between her and her attorney. I do feel like when push comes to shove, her treatment team and her evaluators are going to have the main say in whether she's released. And I think because they're the ones who've been with her and evaluated her over and over again. And so she very well may want to speak and talk about her treatment and those kinds of things. But if there are things that have happened more recently in the past couple of years that she would have to explain or talk about, her attorney may discourage her from speaking up because of that.
And given just the entire situation, when I say the entire situation, I'm talking about from the time of the offense to even now. In your opinion, do you think Morgan Geyser should be released on conditional release?
Well, I think, there's a couple of arguments here. One, of course, is at some point she's going to have to be released. I mean, I guess she doesn't have to be for 40 years, but I think most people would think that given the fact that she was 12 years old at the time that she committed this, that she deserves a chance to do that. So then I think the question becomes, what is going to happen to her once she is released? And so, I think that really is the big question. Is there a place where she can go where she's going to be closely supervised? Are there people going to be around her? What kind of supervision, what kind of conditions are going to be put on her in terms of social media, for example, in terms of access to TV or all those kinds of things? So I think it's not so much a matter of, do I think should she be released? It just becomes, can we release her in a way that's going to minimize the risk to the public and give her a chance? Because there's always the argument that, okay, well, yes, she hasn't been violent toward others for many, many years, and then the other side of that is always, well, she's been in this kind of captive environment where she's closely supervised. So she, how could she do this or whatever? Well, we know that she's managed to harm herself when she's, been in the psychiatric hospital. So it's not within the realm of possibility, or without the realm of possibility, that she could harm somebody else. But the bigger picture is, we're not going to know. We're not going to know 100% if she is safe to be released until we actually give her a chance to show us that she can do that. Now, if I'm the victim's family, I may not think that should happen for 30 years. But I do think that at some point, the goal is going to be to give her a chance to move to not a free environment, but at least a less restrictive environment, to see if she can make that transition.
Right, Dr. Joni Johnston, I always appreciate your insight into the cases that we cover here. Before we sign you off, anything else about the Morgan Geyser and the Slender Man stabbing case that you would like to add?
I think just the thing that I think all of us think about at the end of the day is these were three 12-year-olds. And, I certainly hope that the two young women now who committed these offenses are making their way in a different path now. But I think it's important to also remember the victim, that we have somebody who was completely innocent here and who suffered a just horrendous offense. And so, it's always easy for us professionals to talk about the pros and the cons, but at the end of the day, I'm not her mom, I'm not her dad. And so I do have a lot of empathy for their perspective as well.
Right, Joni, again, thank you so much for your time today. It's always appreciated.
I always enjoy it. Thanks, Elizabeth.
And the judge set a hearing for Morgan Geyser next month on November 1st. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.